Hi, this is Andy. Back in episode 236, we had Amy Edmondson on to talk about psychological safety. Now, it's likely not a new idea to you that there are so many benefits to our projects and our teams when we foster a culture of psychological safety. The idea of psychological safety is straightforward, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Because of that, I'm always on the lookout for resources that can help us make progress on developing trusting relationships on teams and in organizations. Well, today I'm excited to introduce you to LaTonya Wilkins, author of a book entitled Leading Below the Surface: How to Build Real and Psychologically Safe Relationships with People Who Are Different from You. In today's discussion, LaTonya will talk about her notion of a below the surface leader and how that's different from being a surface leader. She'll talk about the terrible three and how they can get in the way of us seeking to be a below the surface leader. Before we're done today, you'll understand how bridging and micro habits can help us on this journey. And LaTonya will share some ideas about how to be a below the surface leader when you're working in a culture that is far more comfortable at the surface level. It's a conversation I'm looking forward to sharing with you. A quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week. It's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Let's jump into today's discussion with LaTonya about her book, Leading Below the Surface. LaTonya, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks for having me, Andy. I'm really looking forward to this.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this as well. Before we get into the book, I'd love for our listeners to just learn more about you. So, and the reason I ask is you mentioned your grandmother a number of times in your book, and I'm interested, what are some ways that your grandma influenced you as you grew up and helped shape you as a clear voice on leading below the surface?
Yeah, so my grandma was the icon and the example for leading below the surface. A little bit about her, and I talk about this in the book. So she grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. She had 4 children. And during the Jim Crow era, she ended up moving everyone up north because of those very laws. And Emmett Till had just been lynched, and my mom she refused to drink from a colored fountain. She was never a yes, ma'am. And so she moved first to Topeka, Kansas, took her children on a bus at that time, had just packed just enough food, and that's pretty much it. And then we ended up in Des Moines, Iowa. And she was just always a light. She was always this person, and I show this picture a lot in my keynotes. She was actually a cafeteria worker for grade school and junior high. So she knew all the kids, like everybody knew her. And she would give kids, slip kids food for free lunch, like especially free lunch kids. She would encourage free lunch kids to eat their vegetables. And she was just always a light. I remember, she was just always very accepting of me, even when other people in the family weren't. And so she's always been my icon. She's always been my model. And that's because she was very, very good with building relationships with people who are different from her. And it didn't really come to life fully. It was almost like full circle during her celebration of life. We had her for 93 years, which is amazing. Yeah, and this young woman came up to me and she, at her celebration of life, and said, are you Tonya? I said, yes, because they call me Tonya. And she's like, your grandma used to always talk about you. She's like, I want you to know that she pretty much raised me when my mom died. And she was like this white woman that was a little bit younger than me. And I'm like, wow, grandma, like you really did build real relationships. And so that's where this influence came from. It was like, my grandma did so much better. Like I worked at so many companies that were like, oh, you have to be diverse and inclusive. And they give you this checklist. But I was like, gosh, grandma really embodied that. And I wanted to put that on paper and bring that into the world.
Yeah, you did beautifully. I mean, I'm sure you could have written a book just on your grandma, but I just got this impression that this whole idea of being inclusive, this whole idea of leading, it's not a matter of trying to fit into some mold. It's not about checking these boxes. It's about living it out. And when you can see it being lived out in somebody like that, so close to you, what a gift, huh? Yeah. Yeah, it is. I'd say the title of your book is really the message as well, right? There are enormous benefits to leading below the surface. So for the sake of understanding what you mean, let's start with what we see most often, surface leaders and surface cultures. So what does it look like to work for a surface leader or in a surface
Mhm.
culture?
Yeah, the service leader is the status quo leader. It's the leader that is afraid of letting people be human at work.
Mm,
So they probably micromanage you. They probably have FaceTime, like you have to be there at certain times of the day. They probably didn't acknowledge any of your challenges or your pain during the pandemic, whether it came from systemic racism, whether it came from just the pandemic itself and losing people, or even now with people that are, might have others in the UK or family members in in the Ukraine. So that's what a surface leader is. They tout the things on paper that are supposed to be great for the company, like the perks, the benefits, like the vacation time, like all those types of things. They stay on the surface, and
mhm.
that's what I mean by that.
Yeah, I think as I read it, I it felt like transactional. It's
Hmm.
people are resources,
Hmm.
that sort of thing. And you
Human
got it
capital. Yeah.
right. Yeah, right. What a terrible name. Yeah, that's a good point. Um, I've got a friend who her mom lived with her right in the last months before her mom died. Her mom had Alzheimer's, and there was such a huge demand on this friend that she, at the end of it, just for mental health reasons, she needed time off. And her company had a policy
Mhm.
for it. So she got some time off. On her first day back, her boss was just like, okay, LaTonya, the goals for this week are, I mean, it was all transactional. And that story just
That's
came to
surface.
mind. That surface, right? Because you had some examples like that too. It's just, oh, you're having some issues here, and it's almost like you're being written off if you each day wasn't a 10 as far as performance. Is that kind of like the idea?
Yeah.
It's all this
Yeah.
transaction.
Someone shared with me the other day too that he was in like his first job out of college. And this is like the epitome of a surface leader. This is like the example of it. And the one of the leaders was bragging that he had fired someone on his team because he had lost his focus after his wife had died of breast cancer. And so he was
Mhm.
basically touting that and saying, you got to be productive and you got to pull yourself up. And, I gave him a chance. I gave him like a month off. But, at that end of the day, it sounds like the same type of leader. At the end of the day, after that month, you got to come back and you got to hit the ground running. And he just couldn't. And so a surface leader is transactional. If you're not meeting the day-to-day requirements that they set for you, and it's not collaboratively, that's not co-set, it's like, these are the things I need you to do. If you cannot do that, then yeah, that's surface, and you might be out of the organization.
But it's also not about being so, and I'm going to be inadequate in saying this, so warm and fuzzy,
Yeah,
so human that we don't have high standards either. Like
I love how
Francis,
you said that.
yeah,
Yes.
because Francis Fry at Harvard, she said
Yeah,
it this way to
I
us:
know
we
Francis.
need high standards and high devotion. And I feel like it's another way of
Hmm.
saying what we're saying, right?
Hmm.
So a below the surface leader doesn't have high standards, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I talk about this on LinkedIn quite a bit because I remember the second week after I released my book, I was talking to like someone I coached on the phone and or on Zoom, and he was like, "I love your book. I love it. I love it." And he was showing me all the marks, and he said, but the one question I have for you is, do you want everybody to be below the surface leaders? I'm like, and as a coach, I answer a question with a question sometimes. And I
Good
said,
call.
well, tell me where that question's coming from. And he said, well, some people just want to be left alone, right? Like
Hmm.
some people don't want you to be warm and fuzzy. And I'm like, yeah, but how would you know that if you didn't get below the surface? And so I love how you're making that distinction, because I think some people see leading below the surface and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm not a therapist. I'm not running a therapy office.
Right.
It's not even that. It's just day-to-day interactions. I mean,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
shift as much as you want. And I talk about this in the book, shift as much as you want, or as
Hmm.
little or as much as you want. Um, but yeah, people are even afraid of empathy because they're afraid if they open that door, it's going to be floodgates of like,
Yeah. Yeah.
people's personal problems that they can't solve.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Uh, I took from your book that there's not one single mold that we have to fit into, right? So this is not a book about how to be like LaTonya. This is not a book about, the 5 easy steps or something like that. But in many ways, I feel like it's just about being real. And you use real as an acronym to, describe below surface leaders. So I'd be interested if you'd walk us through those letters. And an interesting twist on this, LaTonya, what does each letter mean, but also what does it not mean?
Yeah.
In the spirit of misunderstanding.
Yeah. First, let me tell you what I came up with this. So before I started my own company, I did the corporate thing, climbed the corporate ladder thing, and I led leadership development and talent teams. And I remember early on, one of the activities that was in a program I inherited was, hey, tell us your leader, let's give me your leadership style. Like, let's answer some questions, and they'll spit out a leadership archetype. And I talk about this in the book where I was on the other end of that. And, there's these archetypes like strategy or, innovative leader. And so you look at these archetypes, but there's not really archetypes that talk about how or focus on how we treat people. Like there's really not. It's like business acumen type archetypes. So I did a ton of research because I was also within that archetype. It's how we treat people, but I was sick of, the inclusive leader archetype is like, that's not, inclusive feels so watered down. So I'm like, and one of the issues a lot of my clients have is like, they're like, we want to do diversity and inclusion, but we feel like it's separate over here. We don't really know when we're done or what we need to be doing. And I'm like, it's part of leadership. And so that's why I develop and coined real leadership. And so it's, what do they mean? What do the words mean? Well, it's acronym relatable first. So that means you're relatable to different types of people. You switch your style to adapt to different types of folks that don't look like you or feel like you. So for example, if you are a company that's mostly made up of men and you talk to the men in a certain way, you have to be relatable to women in another way, right? And so you have to be aware of who you're talking to. The second is equitable leaders. And equity, again, it's usually something over here on the side. It's like a side dish. But in real leadership, it's actually part of the main dish. And what that means is that you're continuously auditing your team for equitable practices. Do people have access? Do they have access to you? That's the biggest one I usually find with leaders is that they don't have access to themselves. Like the access is not equitable. Where, for example, Bob may play golf and they go get business done on the golf course, but Susan, maybe she doesn't play golf and she goes home early because she's a young child, or maybe she doesn't have a young child. Maybe she has like a hobby that she does. So are you creating opportunities for Bob and Sue both to have access to you? That's the thing that a lot of leaders miss. They're like, oh yeah, well, Susan doesn't play golf, so what? So what else? How can you give her access? How aware are you about yourself? Not just 360s. People jump to assessments, but how aware are you about your fears with certain types of people? How aware of you? Like earlier today, I talked about empathy and how some leaders are afraid of empathy. How are you aware of that? And are you okay with admitting that? Are you okay with admitting the things that you might not be great at, that are traditional leadership practices that you might be, docked on in your performance review? Again, this is what I mean by aware, getting real with yourself. And then loyal, which is so important. And this actually ties to psychological safety. I was having a conversation earlier today about this, but it's like loyalty, the way this plays out is that a lot of our clients are hiring people that look different in historic numbers. They look different, like especially when we work with leadership teams, they look different from their leadership team. And so, and so many times, Andy, people call me like 2 months later, they're like, I don't think she fits. What do you mean? Like she's been there for 2 months. Well, I don't know. She doesn't really speak up. Well, maybe she has a different type of, communication style. And so it's having the loyalty to the person. And loyalty doesn't mean you accept mediocrity. What it means is like, wow, this is when you're doing change, it's like, it's up and down. And when you're bringing someone on to your team that's different, there's going to be some shock to the system, and you have to roll with that. And you have to give that extra time. And it's not going to be like you're adding like, your buddy from college to your team. You're adding someone different. And so that's going to really test your ability to make others belong and to create psychologically safe environments. So that's what loyalty is. It's being loyal to that process, even though it's not a straight line. And so again, relatable, equitable, aware, and loyal.
I also took loyal, see if I got this right, of the I'm not going to just cut the cord with one mistake, right? There's something I am almost like that deep devotion idea. Like I am for you, LaTonya, and and it is so obvious that I'm for you that's a version of loyalty. Would it be? Would that be along the lines? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like the mistake might be, I mean, it depends on how you see the mistake. The mistake could be like a typo in an email, or the mistake could be maybe you didn't speak up in a meeting.
Right.
Like,
yeah. That's
maybe you were trying to observe, right? It's like, how do you see the mistake? And it's, it's really interesting. I love and I use the word mistake a lot, in the book too, because it also coincides with Amy's work. But that's one thing I would love for everybody to kind of think about is like, what is a mistake to you? Like as a leader or as someone that's running projects, what do you consider a mistake? And is it really a mistake, or is it just a difference in style or approach?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly how to answer the question of what do they not mean, but one thought that came to mind as I was reading it was relatable doesn't necessarily mean we have to agree on everything. But so can you think of anything else that like relatable means I'm curious enough to understand you, but that doesn't mean we have to like vote the same or whatever, I'm saying, like, but we can relate to each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have to do this every day because, I work with a lot of leadership teams that don't look like me. And so the way that I relate to them might be different to how I relate to people that look like me and my friends. And so it's understanding what's important to them and speaking their language, trying to figure that out. And it's and when Pete, you say speak my language, it sounds like terrible because it's like adjust to me. But when I'm saying that, I mean this from a coaching perspective. Like everybody co-creates every relationship, so you're co-creating that, and that's what that relatability means. Is like, hey, we're different. I'm adjusting to that, and I'm letting you bring your full identity in your space, and I'm being curious about that.
Yeah. That's how I understood it as well. I mean, there's so many things that can get in the way of us doing that. I'd love for you to explain to us the terrible three and why we do well to learn to recognize those.
Yeah, so that's another term that I kind of coined with leading below the surface, because I'm sure most of the people that are listening today, you've been through an unconscious bias course and you're like, oh gosh, like I don't really know what to do. And that didn't really do anything. It made me feel worse. Oh no. So you will really, for those folks that have been through that, you'll really love chapter 3 of Leading Below the Surface. It's called Humans Were Born to Exclude. And I talk about one of the ways that we were born to exclude is that we're all biased. And I talk about the top 3 biases that I see in the workplace. And I call them the terrible threes. And the reason why I use that title is so all of you will remember that. And so the first one is affinity bias. So we like to roll and rock with people who are like us, right? We rock with people that are like us. And that could mean that everything from like you're a mother and so you hang out with other mothers to, you play video games, so you hang out with other people that play video games. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying it's just something we do. I was working with one company once based in Seattle, and the affinity bias there was that the people who liked the outdoors and who did hiking stuff, they got promoted faster. And so it's like, and they're like, well, that's what we do, so why wouldn't we? No, but again, it's a bias, and it's not that it's good or bad. Like everybody puts it in like a binary good bad category. It's just acknowledging, hey, all of our executives are, hikers or, mountaineers or whatever, but understanding that. The second one is affinity bias, the second one is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is just what we talked about, the loyalty. You get someone in, they're there for a couple months, they do something wrong, and you're like, oh, I knew it. I knew they weren't going to work out. Why did I hire them? Gosh, I knew it. That's confirmation bias. And again, you have to have loyalty to get over that. The third one is in-group bias. And in-group bias is probably one of the most notorious of the three, because it's really hard to break. I'm sure some of you that are listening heard the Manchester United version of, or that study where people, if they basically they saw fans fall on the ground, and they only helped up the people that had the same jerseys or that had Manchester jerseys on. If they had the other jersey on of the other team, they didn't help them. And so this is a classic study, and that shows in-group bias. In-group bias can be so strong that we can't even have empathy for people in the out-group. And so think about that. I mean, I want everybody to go back to the 2020 election. This probably sounds familiar, right? Right? Where we have that in-group bias and we think that our group is right. I'm not saying that they are right or wrong, but it's like the affiliation so bad that people were like, I don't even want to talk to them. They're this, they're that, on both sides, right? And so that's what that is. It's very dangerous in the workplace, because, and I see it a lot where certain teams have an in-group bias. Like, for example, in large companies, there might be like a paramount experience that you can have, like maybe you do like a rotation in sales or something, and those are the special kids, right? Those are the people that get promoted the most, or that was like a premium experience. And then there's this in-group bias that if you haven't ever worked in sales or did a rotation in sales, you're not going to be good at this job, and the job has nothing to do with what it is. So sales has nothing to do with that job. So that's what I mean by in-group bias. And so I want all of you to challenge yourselves, and again, go back to your life and think about, groups that where you might have that in-group bias, and where it's so strong. Again, we were born to exclude because we exclude to belong. Like, we want to belong to that group so much, and we want to create this deep affinity that we exclude others, and it can get really ugly.
Yeah. Adam Grant had a line. He goes, "My favorite bias is the I'm not biased bias." so the idea is that I love how you laid it out in the book. I feel like it's a really nice, concise, like just in your face, in a good way, like memorable. There's more biases we could talk about, but these right here, just realize, and that could be everything from a hiring discussion to a coaching discussion, that we're gonna think differently based on these biases, and then we'll find the data that supports them, right? The confirmation bias, and if we're not aware of them, and I don't know if you agree. I don't know. You don't have to. I feel like as much as I try to overcome these, I probably struggle with it far more than what I even realized. Right? So we just have to keep reminding ourselves of these.
We do. I mean, especially when like a person like me, when I think about affinity bias, and when I was building my team in Change Coaches, I still am. There was one person, I won't say who, because they might be listening to this, that I was like, I don't know if I should hire this person. Like, they're not typically what I would do. And again, that was affinity bias, where it was like, if they don't have affinity towards certain groups or certain, like ICF and other organizations, like I shouldn't hire them. And I ended up hiring the person, and they're doing great, and I had to acknowledge and be aware of that bias, because I almost didn't bring them in.
Yeah. It's so interesting how it can affect things. And once, like you said, we think we're right about it.
I mean, it was the confirmation bias. And I was like, yeah, I have to eat my own dog food here. Cause I was like, yeah, no. Cause it's like the person did something and I was like, wait, that's not, and I'm like, no, this is great. They have some other things to offer. So again, it just happens so quickly, Andy, as you said. Yeah, it just happens real fast. So it's just being aware of it.
When I think of like being more real or getting below the surface with someone, especially one-on-one, it feels to me like it's a bit of a dance, right? One way to be more real is it's like this dance of progressive disclosure. Because if you just unload everything right away, people might not be ready for it. But it's like this, I take the initiative to learn more about you. And then as you share, I share. And if I recall correctly, that's similar to your idea of bridging. Bridging. So how do you describe bridging, and maybe example of how you've seen it done well?
Yeah, so it's what it does. I've used it actually a lot in conflict management, where it's a practice of, the more that you put out there, you basically build trust with people slowly and slowly. So the more nuggets, or the the more micro trusts that you put out there, let's like imagine that these are like chips. Each time you put a chip out, it's like, oh, trust me, and the person accepts that chip, then they move closer to you. So that's the metaphor I'll use. And so it's really, really good for conflict resolution. I use it a lot for that, especially in my coaching. And the conflict resolution where it's been particularly helpful around is one leader had laid off a bunch of folks in the organization, and he had to work on rebuilding trust. And so he had to bridge with several people for them to be able to trust enough to be productive. And so it's like, imagine him going and buying a bunch of chips, and he just distributes those little by little with each person. And with each chip that's accepted, I mean, it's got to be accepted. It's got to be wanted on the other end. And there's got to be value in that chip. And that value in that chip, I want you to think that chip is like the realness. Like every chip is like the more real you get, the closer and closer someone gets to you. The reason why I wrote about bridging in the book is because people, like I've been to a million workshops on how to build trust, and it is bridging. It's like, it's very slow. And it's like, it is little nuggets, it's little chips. And it's like, you're collecting those as you go along, bringing the person closer and closer to you. So that's what bridging is. And that's how I've used it a lot.
I'm thinking of that person who said to you, but LaTonya, not everybody wants to go deep. I suppose bridging is a little like you take a step, and if they don't feel comfortable with that, you're not like, hey, I read this book, you need to tell me your social security. I'm like, no, it's like you're taking a step at a time. I love your picture actually in the book of you're wading deeper into the water, is the way I recall it in the book, and just a step at a time. I like your idea of the chips too. That's good. Yeah. Yeah. One way to become more below the surface leaders, more often at least, is to identify what you call micro habits. And so I'd be interested if you could share a couple examples of micro habits.
Yeah, that's a good transition, because a good segue, because you just talked about, how to do that. So the micro habits, I bring those a lot into empathy. A lot of folks, especially leaders that are surface leaders that want to move more below the surface, they don't really practice empathy. I mean, the DDI study said 40% of leaders do it, less than half on a regular basis. When I facilitate empathy interviews with executives, it's mind-blowing to them because they've never done this before. So a micro habit with empathy is, instead of jumping all in and asking all the questions I say to ask in the book, or trying to take all the actions you could take in the book, it's taking a step back and just doing what I call P2B listening, which is person to belonging listening, and just observing more. That's if you're afraid to ask people questions, and you're afraid that it's gonna be rickety, or you're afraid it's gonna be awkward, or clumsy. I love that word, clumsy. Some people have said that before. Then just start by observing. And that's a good way you can start, because if you can observe someone and you can observe them without interruption, you can determine like how they're feeling in the moment, their body language. You can determine a lot from that, especially if you're observing them in a group situation. So a micro habit would be shifting to the smaller place and then going further. The micro habit might be, okay, I'm going to try to listen in one more meeting this week. And then by the end of the month, I'm going to listen more in 4 more meetings. And then by the end of the 4 or 5 months, you might be having fully empathetic conversations. So that's what I mean by micro habit. So it becomes a habit, and it's something that, while it's uncomfortable to start, you're feeling comfortable enough with that first step that you can keep going and going and going.
I was really attracted to the idea because sometimes it's hard to just jump from the high dive, right? But if we can just, like you were talking about, just taking little steps, these little things, like I think one of yours was just put your phone away. Like sometimes that's a little thing. Like every once in a while, LaTonya, I want to look down and double check levels, but I feel like if I look down like this, like you can see me, the listeners can, that could look like I'm being distracted, right? And so it's little things sometimes of keep your phone in a purse or in a pocket or tucked away, or you talk about sharing your slips, which I don't know, that wasn't really a micro habit. It was in that same section of just, sometimes I feel like I help when I'll say, I don't know how to say this, LaTonya, so help me if I say this wrong, or something like, it's not really a share your
Yeah.
slip, but it's admitting that we don't have it all together, right? That's kind of along those lines.
It's, hey, that was clumsy, LaTonya.
That was good. Yeah.
I tried, but it was clumsy. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was clumsy. Haha.
Yeah.
Next time, just think about how that lightens things up.
Mhm.
Instead of, oh my gosh, I made a mistake, or it's just like,
Yeah.
oh man, that was clumsy. Next time I'll be better. Okay.
Yeah. I suppose that's the awareness, or part of the awareness of the
Yeah.
real, I suppose. Yeah. But let's say people listening to us, like, I'd have to think there's plenty of people that are going to listen and say, I love what you're talking about. I mean, the problem is I don't work in a below the surface culture. My boss is as surfacey as you can get. I'm not sure it can work for me. Okay. I'm sure you hear that. So what are some ways you might coach someone who feels that way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was my life.
Right.
And um, one of the things that I'll say is if you are hearing this today and your boss is surfacey, you probably need to move into a below the surface job, especially if it's something that you like. Maybe this is like the moment you're like, oh, wow, that's what's wrong, is that my boss um, is not below the surface. And so, yeah, I would say find other below the surface leaders, like people that want to talk about this stuff. You could find them in workplace, like different communities in the workplace, including ERGs, including other communities that, I mean, now that things are opening up a little bit more, there are some areas that you can do that within your company or outside the company. But if you're feeling that way, I also want you to take out a pen and a sheet of paper and think about the below the surface leaders that you've had in your career. I'm sure you've had one or two at least. I know for me, before I really started looking, it was like 4 or 5 that I had, in my early career. And give them a call and tell them about leading below the surface, and tell them that you want to work with people like this. And they would be so happy to hear from you, because they'll be so happy to hear that you're calling them a below the surface leader, and that they'll be honored. And so that's some ways to start. It's really building a community, like whether it's in or out, making a list of the below the surface folks that you know for support. And number 3, like I said earlier, finding that below the surface culture. They are out there, and I will attest to that because I'm working with them every day.
Mm. Something else I took from your book, and I don't remember exactly how you said it, LaTonya, but I thought it was a beautiful way to say it, that you may not be able to change the entire organization, although that's not an excuse not to if somebody has that ability. But there is something about local, that in some ways everything is local. So what can I do on my team, even though I'm not going to change my boss immediately, for the team that I have responsibility to serve? Can I create more of it there, and maybe do some bridging or some nudging with my boss up, like lead with some transparency much, but foster as much as we can in the groups that we most influence.
Yeah, it's funny because I would say every month, I do several keynotes a month, but every month I get feedback from at least one keynote where people are like, that was great. I hope my boss was listening. Right. And I'm like, oh man, do you really have to wait for that? That's like, right. Yeah. So, yeah, I think the big thing is, one of the things, again, I talk about P2B listening, and like, listening more to your team than just steering the ship, and maybe even bringing up this type of below the surface leadership, the concepts on your team, and starting with your team. Because if you can get your team on board, your manager is eventually going to get on board. And so if you can kind of talk about these concepts and articulate how they'll change your team, how they'll be good for your team. A lot of you lead projects. And so if you can articulate that, your boss will come along. And if not, who cares? You have a whole community of folks that will use it with people that are your clients, like internal or external clients. They're going to love it. They love this stuff. And so that's the other thing, is like, either your boss is going to have to move along, but also don't put so much emphasis on your boss. I mean, we put too much on that one person, And that doesn't define, your boss is not the entire culture of the company. Like, you can move to a different spot, or again, practice this stuff with your clients and other people, and that's going to open doors. That's going to make other people that you do this with, that's going to make them remember you. That's going to make them want to introduce you to other people, expand. I mean, I see it every day.
Yeah. Yeah. So many more ideas I'd love to talk with you about, but let's end with this. In addition to everything else we've talked about, what's one of your favorite bits of coaching advice that you could share with those who want to get better at being this below the surface leader?
Yeah, this is the advice I got early on, and it was like, when I started my business, it was like, just give, and keep giving, and don't worry about getting something back from that. And I think that's the advice that's so important for below the surface leadership, because you might feel like, hey, you're putting a lot out there, but you're not really getting it back. But wait, because it's going to be a waterfall. It's going to happen. It's like, it's like kind of what happened with my business. It was like huge waterfall. Like, for, 6 months, I was like doing all this stuff, and I'm like, gosh, I do too much for free, or I do too much for this person. And I'm telling you, those people will remember you. They'll remember. There's the saying, is it Maya Angelou? People always remember how you made them feel. And that is so true. So if you are making them feel good, they are going to come back to you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Generosity. And I really appreciate your point in the book about empathy as your fallback. If you don't know what to do, err on the side of empathy, you're probably going to go below the surface, right? Yeah. Well, for those listening, if you resonate with what you've been hearing from LaTonya, consider getting a copy of her book, Leading Below the Surface. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So LaTonya, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.